This Shabbat, Parashat Shemot, is right between two yortzites for my family. First one being this past Wednesday was the 26th yortzite for my paternal grandmother, my Safda Rachel. And this upcoming Wednesday is my mother's 8th yortzite. And so I often teach on this Shabbat, and the Torah and the words that I share is in both of their memories. But I thought actually this morning that I would focus a little bit on my grandmother, on Safda Rachel. She was born in Zastavna, Chernovitz, which today is a part of Ukraine, in 1912. So in 1912. And she died in 1999 at the age of 87. And like Moshe Rabbeinu and my mother, she merited to die on her birthday. She is the eldest of 5 sisters, and their parents were fierce Zionists in the early 20th century. And as young girls, all 5 of them learned Hebrew from a very young age. Upon marrying my grandfather, who I'm named after, Yacov Fruchter, she joined him in a small farm town, quite different than the larger city that she grew up in. And by 1942, she lived a truly beautiful life. She was the mother of a 9- and 6-year-old boys, and she was pregnant at the time with a 3rd. And like for everyone else living in Europe at that time, in 1942, her life was turned around. She was separated from my grandfather, Yacov, who together with his uncle, also Yacov Fruchter, they were taken to one part of the Transnistria labor camps, and she found herself in another part. And at that stage in her life, she assumed a new identity. You know, a term that's actually used quite frequently today, but I don't think was used too often back then. And she found herself becoming a death doula. Over the course of 2 or 3 short months in 1942, she witnessed and cared for many family members as they died. This included her father-in-law, her Aunt Tzila, and when her Aunt Tzila died, she took care of Tzila's 3 children and watched and comforted them as they too died. And probably worst of all, she watched her own 2 children as they took their last breaths and also delivered her baby in those days. And it's unclear to us whether she lived for 10 days or a little bit longer, but it was a short life indeed. My eldest daughter, Shiloneta, is actually named for one of those sons, one of my uncles. All of them, as was common at the time, died of typhoid. And then my Safda Rachel was alone. No one to care for, but somehow she survived. And that, of course, wasn't the end of her story, but I'll come back to her in a little bit. As we already heard this morning, and noticed as we read from the Torah, this parsha is just chock full of inspiring stories. And I want to just focus on one for just a moment. Rabbi Friar Bodzin began this morning by telling us about the Me'aldot HaIvriyot, the Jewish midwives. In a nutshell, the story of the midwives is that they defied Pharaoh. Pharaoh's instructions were clear, that as Jewish baby boys were born, they were to be murdered instantly. As they were coming out, remove them from their mothers and kill the baby boys. And they didn't listen. Instead, they allowed these boys to come to life, and they cared for them and they nurtured them. Nechama Leibovitz, the acclaimed and incredible Tanakh teacher who lived in the 20th century, discusses in her book, Tanakh, there are really two schools of thought in terms of trying to explain who were these midwives. One school of thought based on early midrashim and adopted by Rashi and the Ramban and Rashbam argues that who are these two famous midwives that are actually named Shifra and Pu'ah? Who are they? They are two Jewish midwives. And we read the words me'aldot ha'ivriot as they themselves were Jewish women. And if we read the story in this way, then they become the archetypes of powerful Jewish women, as Rabbi Freierbadzin mentioned, the model for all of us in terms of the way that women, and in this case Jewish women, can stand up against oppression and stand tall and even defy Pharaoh. And to imagine two Jewish women at that time doing that, we shouldn't minimize it. It is absolutely incredible. But there's another school of thought. And this one follows the traditions of Philo and Josephus and gets adopted also by the medieval Rabbi Abarbanel, who argue that these two midwives were in fact Egyptian. And their argument was based on the fact of why would Pharaoh ever trust Jewish midwives to follow his decree of murdering Jewish babies? That would just be impossible. And so if we follow this school of thought, then these midwives, not me'aldot ha'ivriot as Jewish midwives, but me'aldot la'ivriot, the ones who would deliver Jewish babies, become the archetype of the righteous among the nations. They become the ones who are willing to stand up for Jewish babies. And that too is incredible. And that too is noteworthy. The commentator Sforno brings a whole other piece to this. And he explains it is impossible to think that there were only two midwives at the time for all the Jewish women. Right? There were thousands and thousands, or maybe even hundreds of thousands, depending on which midrashim we read, of Jewish babies being born, which means there must have been thousands of midwives. And yet, the actions of these two in defying Pharaoh's decree was enough to get Pharaoh to change his tactic. And so according to Sforno, these were the two leading midwives. And when they acted, when they used their power in that moment, they were incredibly influential. And all the other midwives followed in their footsteps. So not only were they brave, outrageously brave, but they were leaders. And they encouraged and inspired others to act in turn. This past summer, we're supposed to be in Israel, as many of you know, but because of the war with Iran, we ended up in Berkeley instead, studying with the Shalom Harmon Institute. And one of the silver linings is I had an opportunity to study a little bit with Rabbi Sharon Brous. And she shared with us some Torah about these midwives. And one of the midrashim that I'd actually never seen before helped me rethink the way I read this story. It comes from Masechet Sotah, and here the midrash describes the steps that Pharaoh takes. Originally, the decree, as we already mentioned, was that these midwives were meant to murder the baby boys as they were born. And when that doesn't work, because of these inspiring midwives, who, by the way, were successful in getting him to change his tactics, but as we all know, Pharaoh just came up with another plan. And what was the new plan? What was it? What do you do with the newborn baby boys?
Put them in the river.
Throw them into the river. So still baby boys were being drowned. According to this midrash, though, which I think is actually a really good reading of the Torah and the text itself, Pharaoh doesn't stop there. He was so afraid of maybe some vision or belief that a new leader was going to emerge. He was so paranoid and terrified that what does his final decree become? This is what was new to me. He actually ordered that all boys be sent into the Nile. Not just the Jewish ones, all of them. And the words are, Kol haben hayilod hayeoa tashlichuhu. And he instructs this to all the Egyptians, that all baby boys at that time have to be murdered. Pharaoh was literally cutting off all future generations in order to somehow survive, which of course doesn't make any sense at all. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who I think of as one of my rebbes, recently published a book called The Triumph of Life. And in it, he continues his teachings from earlier books. One of my favorites of all time is called The Jewish Way, where he says all of these stories of the Torah, and in fact all of Judaism, is about teaching both Jews and all good people of conscience that our job in this world is to use our power to affirm life and human dignity and to bring goodness into this world. And that work needs to be continuous. That certainly in our time, in our day, we can find opportunities to be exactly like those midwives, to be inspirational, to be brave, to be courageous. That according to Rabbi Greenberg, that is literally our job. And that is the message and the mission of the Jewish people, is to bring that courage into the world. Professor Aviva Zornberg really beautifully wrote that the very extremity of the edict that Pharaoh gives forces a new moral vision upon the midwives, a radical choice between life and death. Disobedience to Pharaoh becomes more than merely a refusal to kill. Because as the Torah describes, not only do they not kill the babies, they actually sustain them. And according to Aviva Zornberg, it becomes a total dedication to nourishing life. This order by Pharaoh, whether they were Jewish heroes or they were righteous among the nations, flips a switch in their brains, and they realize not only do we have to stand up to this injustice, but we have to be sources of life. And what are their names? Shifra and Pu'ah. According to the Midrash, Shifra, because as the babies would come out of their mother's wombs and the birthing canal, she would smooth them with her hands, bringing them into life with tenderness and with care. And why the name Pu'ah, which is often attributed to Miriam? Because she would make the poo sounds. She would coo to these babies, bringing them into the world with tenderness and with love. Back to my Safda Rachel and the continuation of her story. It is unbelievably painful to think about, as I mentioned before, in 1942, witnessing all of these family members die, but especially her 3 children. And it is painful to think about the fact that a few short years later, she was reunited with my grandfather Yacov. And to just imagine for a moment that conversation where she has to tell her husband that his father died, that their aunt died, the cousins, and that his 3 children were all dead now. Rabbi Greenberg says, and actually in keeping with Yonatan's words this morning, that anyone who is Jewish today, who identifies with the Jewish people, who comes to shul, wears a Magen David, is choosing to be Jewish, is making a choice. And my Safda Rachel made a choice to continue to live a Jewish life. Within a year of their reunification, my uncle, Tzvi, who's still alive today and lives in Israel, was born in a DP camp. Fast forward 7 years. It is now 1952. They just arrived to Israel. And I think in keeping with the words and the name of Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg's book, The Triumph of Life, my grandparents choose to name their brand new born baby, my father, Chaim. The name Chaim, the one who is alive and who will live and will allow them to continue to triumph with life. Shabbat Shalom.